Hey everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel, Sports and International Politics. I'm Ilya, and sitting here with me is Arya.
Hi guys.
Today we're going to dive deep into the Himalayan mountains and examine a couple of cases, taking the bare necessities, surviving oxygen tanks, basically dancing with death. Would you do something like that, Arya?
Yeah, actually I think I would go.
Really? But why? Any particular reason?
No, but because the fact that the mountain is there, so why not?
Interesting proposal. However, could you elaborate?
Well, it was the exact same reason that Sir Edmund gave back in 1953 when he was asked why he climbed the mountain.
Well, I think that's as good as a reason as any, and as a good intro for our listeners tonight. Well, today we'll just be talking about the first documented case of the climb to Mount Everest, right?
Exactly.
But it's not just going to be us chatting about the expedition, because we're actually going to make a sort of perspective on this entire thing, give it an international aspect as well as looking at this soft power aspect.
Yeah, the famous soft power. But did you know that soft power wasn't really a thing before 1980s?
I did not know that.
Well, it was created by two American political scientists, coined the terminology of neoliberalism with international relations.
And when we're talking about soft power, we're talking about how countries are able to influence other countries using more passive factors. So it's not like using the military, it's more using culture and sports.
Yeah, and what better way to do it than to sport like mountain climbing?
Right. In fact, let's take a closer look at soft power through the neoliberalist lens.
Neoliberalism is an economic and political theory that wants supply and demand to regulate production and labor, not wanting governments to interfere in the process. Also characterized by its belief in individual freedom and responsibility, and perhaps neoliberalism would view soft power through cultural means.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, well, anyway, the first official summit of Mount Everest happened on May 29th, 1953 by the Brits. And I think we would like to talk about why and how this evolved, like climbing mountains and how it happened.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Well, before the end of the 1800s, it wasn't even a topic of discussion. It was only in 1985 that it was suggested that it was theoretically possible to climb Mount Everest.
Yeah, and actually that means that mountaineering isn't that old of a sport. I think the first recorded like modern mountaineering of Mont Blanc was in 1786. So on a wide perspective, that's actually not that long time. And that was way longer or way before oxygen tanks that are used today were actually invented as advanced equipment for mountain climbing.
Before people started doing it for fun, it was mainly associated with necessity since nomadic tribes were constantly on the move, and the ones in mountainous regions had no choice but to go trekking over them looking for a place to stay.
Yeah, no doubt, that's true. And actually, the Chinese were also doing mountain climbing before it was a sport, because they used to believe, or some of them still believe, that the gods lived in the mountains, so that they would do these mountain walks to get closer to the gods. Also, like in modern time, UNESCO has protected Mount Sai since it's one of the most famous and sacred mountains in China in relation to the god beliefs.
Good to know. So why are people climbing mountains today? I mean, how do you train for something like that? I can't imagine just anyone can do it. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world, after all.
Yeah, well, it's definitely categorized as an extreme sport, mountain climbing, and the amount of training and preparation and the experience that you need to have is also something that you need to consider before doing any extreme climbings like Mount Everest. It takes like strong physique, strength, endurance, flexibility, and it's like things we wish that we could do naturally, but you can't forget that you need to train intensively before doing these climbs.
Oh, for sure. So just like any professional sport, it requires some setup.
It does. And you also have to think that they need to acclimatize during the climb to the summit, which means that they can't just climb in one bit. You have to take it step by step. So they need to climb up a step, go back down again, climb up again, so their bodies get used to climbing or the environment on the mountain.
Are you speaking from experience here?
Well, I might be, but it was nowhere like near the trip to Mount Everest.
Logically, and you lived to tell the tale of your climb.
Yeah, but we can take that another day.
You and your stories, I swear. But all right. I know that climbers also need to get permission from the government, either the Nepalese or Chinese government has to issue basically a climbing permit depending on which side they actually decide to climb. Was that the same when Hillary and Tenzing went?
Yeah, I mean, it's still the case today, but back then the Nepalese government had just opened its borders for foreigners. So Edmund also needed to have a permit to climb the mountain, but he also needed to have local people traveling with him during the climb.
All right, then. That's very important for us to talk about, and that leads us into talking about the specifics about this milestone in mountaineering history, the conquest of Mount Everest.
Yes, and as I mentioned, the Nepalese government had just opened their borders for foreigners after a long century of rule by the Rana regime that essentially closed the country for foreigners and the rest of the world. So it was in 1951 when there was a political revolution that all of these things were overturned and changed in Nepal.
So, in a nutshell, their intentions were to open the country back up, boost their own economy, and accept foreign visitors.
Yep, and it wasn't like a long time after the Hillary climb that Tanzania also reached the summit after the Brits and boosted Nepal's economy even more than it was before.
And as we talked about prior, this is soft power basically doing its thing, enticing all these climbers into the country and allowing them to access the once closed off country and basically let them culturally expand in a way.
Most definitely. And like how these sort of thing happens, they happen under the surface. So of course, at the time, it wasn't really a thing. And as we said, it wasn't until like the 1980s that the term soft power really came to exist.
This obviously had a huge impact on Nepal and its economy for the years to come. But what did it do for the Brits in this case?
Well, it gave them some newly found prestige, although that Hillary was actually New Zealand. But back then, New Zealand was part of the British Commonwealth, so that's why it was considered to be a British success story. And actually, a fun fact, Hillary was actually a beekeeper in New Zealand before he became a mountain climber.
Yeah, I read that. Fascinating how he went from a beekeeper to basically the most famous mountain climber in the world.
Well, I mean, bees also love altitudes, so especially the Himalayan honeybees. And I wonder if he ever saw anyone who was up in the top.
Well, only that's for him to know, not really for us. But beekeeper of Everest, that has a good ring to it, I feel.
It does. So anyway, the conquest happened almost simultaneously with Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, and that's where she started the British achievements of Mount Everest, which was a gift to her coronation.
An unplanned gift, but they've been trying to basically do this thing since the 1920s. So, good enough that it fit, I guess.
Well, I said it's a lovely surprise.
Because this point in history opened the doors for the Brits to, across the globe, and basically give them their turn at soft power.
Well, so basically promoting their own prestige and inventiveness as a second to none.
Exactly. I would agree to that. There was a journal article written in the 1980s proving just that the praise the organization received of the expedition was proof of their scientific expertise. Basically, them having a backbone now.
Well, this event also grew the relation between the Britain and Asia much closer. In fact, Nepal and the UK remain in good relation today after the climb.
Wasn't it during the research expedition when Hillary spoke with a Sherpa member and asked for his wishes on how to support the Nepalese people living in the Solukhumbu district?
Yes, it was, and the wishes for support for their children by building new schools. So in 1961, Hillary actually built the first school in Kumunju. Later, 26 more schools followed, and a small hospital were also built. So New Zealand volunteers were actually working in the hospital that was built at the time.
I've also heard about the Sir Edmund Hillary Foundation. What was that for, and when was it founded?
Yes, and it was founded in 1974 to continue providing support and empowerment for the Sherpa people. It focused on the areas of education, it focused on healthcare and on environment. And by the way, did you know that Sir Edmund Hillary was the first one to be granted honorable citizenship by the Nepalese government.
I have heard about that actually. That was during the 50th anniversary of the first successful ascent of Everest, correct? Should we explain a bit broader what the relationship is between Nepal and the UK?
Sure. So the UK shares a long history of friendly relationship with Nepal since the climb, and they continually collaborate in trade, in culture exchange, and on education. So the UK remains one of the largest donors for the Nepalese government, and they warmly welcome Nepalese students in the British schools.
Hmm. And as Hillary was from New Zealand, the relations between Nepal and New Zealand are also warm, right? New Zealand founded the Sir Edmund Hillary Fellowship in 2008, which facilitates young leaders from Nepal and India on their visits to the island, correct? Yeah. The government of New Zealand also continues to honor annual donations into the Himalayan Trust Fund, correct?
Yes, and all this actually demonstrate quite well how much sport event can contribute to international relationships between countries. So it sounds like the economic, cultural, and political relations were actually a successful outcome of the climb.
All what we've said prior to this basically proves what soft power can really do, right?
Yes, well, at its best, so that's what it does. And we should also remember that the UK was not the only country who tried to do the climb to be the first conqueror of the highest mountain of the world. They managed to be the first, but China actually also climbed the mountain short after.
But how did that play a big role, though?
Well, China was actually quite explicit about their interest in expanding their territory back then. And in 1950, China asserted its control over Tibet, which is around the area, and they haven't actually let it go since then.
Yeah, the entire Tibetan China question is a very difficult topic, but I guess China didn't like the way it looked to the world if they weren't able to conquer their own mountain. Kind of, logical, seeing it was partially in their territory back then.
That's true, and that China really wanted to expand their influence back in the 1950s into Nepal.
China and India were both quite interested in diplomatic relations with Nepal.
Yes, exactly, and Nepal stand by their claim that they're an independent country and they won't be influenced by external powers as China.
As should most nations, logically. But what was this about the Brits taking the easy way to the top?
Well, I don't think that anything about the climb was easy. There were difficult discussions about the different ridges of the north and the south of the mountain.
The north being Tibet and the south was where the British teams entered the mountains, down in Nepal.
Yes, and the north being classified as the difficult route, so that's where the discussion is. So even though the British team made it first, the Chinese took the advantage of the fact that there were another route to the top, and that they were going to be the ones to make it through that route.
Basically, they secured their own bragging rights. But they weren't doing it alone. They had invited the Soviets on their expedition as well.
Yeah, until tensions grew too high in Tibet in 1959, and they withdrew. But when they withdrew, all the equipment and funding went with them.
Logically. So, did they ever make it up there?
Honestly, it looks like it's still up for debate. There was a lack of photographical evidence, and China published a specialized report themselves.
Yeah, and plus you have to remember that this was during the Cold War, and there was a general mistrust between the West and the communist states.
Well, it's definitely a factor, and was put to rest moreover after the Japanese took the Sage route in 1975 that the Chinese had mapped out.
So they needed some third-party affirmation, basically.
Well, it helped, and it still doesn't say much for the lack of photo evidence to prove that they were actually up in the summit, up there.
True, but nowadays most sources say that the 1960 climb was authentic, so let's go with that. However, it was definitely not as successful as the earlier ascent by the British team.
Right, and the Chinese ascent to the top was also the third, after all. So it was the British who were the first, and then the Swiss who were the second. China also already had its reputation in the area, especially after the invasion of Tibet in the 1950s. But China and Nepal are in friendly relations today, although, and they both help each other.
yeah, they hold good diplomatic relations up to this day, even though their prior altercations would suggest otherwise. Issues regarding Mount Everest are also settled quite nicely between China and Nepal, surprisingly.
Right, and only a few years ago in 2020, they agreed on new official height, which was 8,848.86 meters for Mount Everest.
I hadn't realized it was so high. Huh. Anyway, should we wrap this up by now? I'm getting a little mountain sick thinking of these heights.
Sure, and it was nice discussing the conquest of Mount Everest with you. We hope you learned something new today.
It was really nice indeed, and we hope you enjoyed the video. And if you did, remember to like it and share your opinions in the comments.
And don't forget to subscribe for more.
And the last question, would you like to reach the top? Think about it.